Good morning again. It's a nice day to be inside. I I first heard about this conference or forum, whatever you call it, about a month ago when Dr. John emailed me, and he said I was talking to Rick Sale, and he said you should come up and do a presentation. And anytime a conversation begins with "I was talking to Rick Sale," you know that it's not going to end well. So as I say, I hadn't really heard of this conference. So while I was reading this email, I opened up the website and I was looking at it, and I thought, wow, there's some impressive people speaking there. There's Dr. Harper, who is, well, once I got over what he used to do to me in the chamber many years ago, bouncing me up and down to see what would happen, and that Doug Elsey guy who has been. I've been a huge admirer of Doug and his work for many, many years. And I used to hang out with Larry Bell, so that tells you something there. And all sorts of Marc-Andre Bernier. I met him for the first time at another conference a few weeks ago. And he's got like the job that I would dream of having. And there's all these other people that are scientists and doctors and the other kind of doctors. And then there's me. And so I'm sort of having an Alice in Wonderland moment up here. And but anyway, as I listened to John, and he said, we'd like you to talk about, we know you do a lot of diving up here, and we'd like you to talk about the history of the shipwrecks and the discovery of the shipwrecks and all this kind of stuff. And I was listening, and I said, no, John, that's not my thing. I said, you need to talk to Stan McClellan. Stan's the guy. We used to say, it's Stan the man. He's the guy who knows everything about the shipwrecks in Tobermory. He's the guy, Stan knows so much, he was on the Arabia when it sunk. That's how much he knows. So then John said, yeah, we already asked him, but he was too busy. And well, meet plan B, that's me. I feel your pain, Doug. And so anyway, I think, I said, John, look, I'm happy to do a talk because I'll get up and talk in front of anybody anytime. And but that's not the topic. But let me think about it. I'll get back to it in a couple of days. So let me just backtrack a little bit. 40 years ago, literally almost to the hour, I was doing my first open water dive in Innerkip Quarry down near London. And it was, I was 18 years old and the water was cold. I was in a rental wetsuit. I think I weighed like 104 pounds or something. And it was really cold, and it lasted 11 minutes. And it was probably, up until that point in my life, the most amazing thing that I'd ever done. And so here we are 40 years later, 5,000 dives later, and I still love the sport as much as I do, and I spend an awful lot of time in Tobermory diving up here. But one of the things that happens when you dive for 40 years is you start to lose your original dive buddies. They get old, and they fall apart, and some of them expire, and there's a few exceptions. One of them sitting here that Jeff and I have been diving together for, 35 years or something up here. But a lot of the younger guys that I dive with, they all think that along with Stan on the Arabia when it sunk, I was right there with them. And I always say, no, that's not the case. There's a whole generation of guys that were up there diving before I was. And so I said to John, how about I talk about those guys? Because those guys have been my heroes forever. But much like I knew that Stan was the man, I didn't really know that much about Stan and where he came from. He was always like the guy who ran Fathom 5. And so I had crossed paths with a few of these people over the years, and I thought, I'm gonna do a little research, and I'm gonna hunt them down, and I'm gonna talk to them. And as I did that, I started to realize that there's enough stuff here that I could write a book, but I've actually only got a little while. So I'm gonna give you the highlights. Now, this audiovisual extravaganza, which I'm about to unleash on you, is, kind of winging it. So I got a little of this, and I got a little of that, and I guess the lights are as out as they're going to get. This projector is a little weird over here, but hopefully it'll do the job. So anyway, what I want to talk to you about is a little bit about, I suppose to start with, the history of diving, because the history of diving is pretty much the same as the history of diving in Tobermory. And it's a new sport, relatively speaking, and certainly anybody who dives. And is it fair to assume that a bunch of you dive? I can't really see you very well. Show of hands. Oh, so a lot of you. That's great. That's too bad, because now I'm going to have to be careful what I say. I was figuring I could just kind of wing it. Yeah. But so anyway, I'll see if I can make this work. I have tentatively entitled this thing The Early Years Diving in Tobermory, 1955 to 1971 or so. The fine print. This is my interpretation of the history of diving in Tobermory. It may or may not be accurate, and it is undoubtedly incomplete. When I began preparing in earnest for this presentation at 5 o'clock this morning, I realized that there is so much information about diving in Tobermory, because it really does mirror what went on in the sport diving world around the place. So as I say, it's pretty much it. So let me backtrack a little bit again. Sport diving never really was invented. You know, somebody didn't sort of wake up one day and said, "Hey, we should invent sport diving." It was a military thing, and over the years, various bits of dive gear were tried out. Ultimately, it was meant to allow people to swim around and blow up stuff undetected, and of course that really reached its at the time great success during the Second World War. And then eventually the Second World War ended, and this dive gear that people were using sort of became available to the general public. And again, because there's a lot of you who dive, you'll know what a rebreather is. And that's a lot of what the guys at the time were using. So that stuff eventually started to become available to the general public. They used to publish plans for it in magazines like Popular Mechanics, and people would build their own dive gear. And they would use it. And as Dr. Harper might talk a little bit in his talk later on, oxygen rebreathers are great things, except they have this bad habit of killing you. And oxygen, as you probably know, actually becomes toxic at relatively shallow depths. And so I'm sure it was an exciting time back then. But anyways, as I mentioned earlier, that I've had the pleasure of sort of crossing paths with a few of these guys. So really all I want to do is tell you a little bit about some of these guys, what I've learned from them over the past few weeks talking with them. And then I've got a little bit of a film that was shot up here in the 60s, which I'll show you a few minutes of. And then I've got towards the end, a little presentation of photographs that I've taken up here in the last couple of years or so. For those of you that have been watching those pictures go by, that's just my screensaver. We don't actually have sharks in Tobermory. And I don't know if anyone noticed, there was a picture of the Arabia, and Jeff was on it, and there was a nice reef shark there. And I put that on Facebook, and I got a lot of comments. And I said, yes, that's the rare Georgian Bay wood shark. But anyway, it's amazing how little people know. I'm not really following this thing, am I, too well? Did I talk about all this stuff already? I think so. So there was a dive shop opened in Toronto. It was called Canada Frogman Supply, which I think is a very cool name. And I think if I opened a dive shop today, I would call it Canada Frogman Supply. It was started by an ex-Royal Navy clearance diver. And I just need a little drink here. I was researching this at the Crow's Nest last night. Anyway, there's a guy in town here. I don't think he's here. Does anyone know Bob Johnson, the chiropractor? Lives down by the end of Big Tub there, has an old sailboat. So Bob started diving in 1952. I wasn't alive in 1952. I wasn't even thought about in 1952. And what I discovered in the last few weeks is that Bob used to work at Canada Frogman Supply, and he started diving up here in the very, very early years. So I mentioned these rebreathers earlier. So this is a picture I found on the interwebby thing. It's a Navy diver from the Italian Navy. They lost, but nonetheless, I think the gear was, I don't know it had anything to do with this guy or his gear. So this is his picture. This is a picture of Bob. This is Bob in 1955 learning how to breathe on a Draeger O2 rebreather at a swimming pool somewhere in Toronto. And similarly, I think he weighs like 90 pounds. He doesn't weigh much more than that now, but anyway, we got talking, and it was really quite interesting to listen to him. And he would describe breathing this O2 rebreather. And as you might know, symptoms of oxygen toxicity, they include things like tingling lips and ringing ears and tunnel vision. And he said, yeah, we'd swim around till we started to feel those things, and then we knew to come up. Awesome. I think that sounds like a great plan. And I have no idea how many of these people died way back when, but I can't imagine that it wasn't more than a few. But and he said, oh yeah, sometimes people would black out, and we would drag them to the surface, and hopefully they'd be okay. And I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. Another guy that I crossed paths with many years ago. In fact, I bought my first equipment from him. Was a fellow named Bob Peters, and Bob still owns a dive shop in Hamilton called Bob Sport and Dive. And Bob was a machinist at Westinghouse, and he got involved in diving very early on. And he also started to come up here in the very late 50s. And Bob, actually, I spent about a half a day with him earlier this week. And I actually wrote this down, and I'm going to refer to my notes a little bit here. But he said, yeah, they didn't actually invent safe until we'd been diving for quite a few years. And he was alluding to, again, the fact that people would get a little twitchy and a little weird and sort of think about blacking out. And then he said, then we had this great idea that if we dove together in pairs, that we could keep an eye on each other. And I thought, wow, that's when they invented the buddy system, and which is kind of like an important part of diving, I hear. But anyway, and he actually said to me, he said, yeah, I remember one of my buddies, he blacked out underwater, so I dragged him to the top, we slapped him around a bit until he came to, and then we carried on our dive. And all that I could think of was back when men were men. And but anyway, it was all it's all been very interesting talking to these guys, and as I could go on up here for days and days and days. But anyway, one of the things that happened, of course, eventually is the rebreathers kind of passed on, and we got into open circuit scuba. Bob was, I think, the first guy to bring a compressor to Tobermory and put it over at Big Tub, and they started to get air fills and some things like that. And along the same time, this Bob Johnson guy that I referred to earlier, he bought himself a camera, and he started to shoot some movies up here. So I'm going to play just a very few minutes of this little film that he shot between, he thinks about 1965 and 1970, and it was partly used as a preamble to help develop this park thing that we all know about here. But as it goes on for, I think the whole film's about 25 minutes, but I'm only going to play 5 or 6 of it. But one of the things, I'm going to talk over it in a couple of places just to kind of point out some interesting things. But if you get bored, just yell and we'll go on to the next thing. So,
in 1788, Captain Gother Mann, speaking of the Bruce Peninsula,
this is Bob narrating
wrote the following warning. The whole coast of this great projecting point, being a steep rock cliff, without any campground or landing place, is exceedingly dangerous for boats or canoes to go around, and is therefore rarely attempted. Of those who have ventured, several have perished. The Bruce Peninsula is a 60-mile jetty of limestone that divides Lake Huron from Georgian Bay. Geologically, it is a continuation of a high ridge of land called the Niagara Escarpment. At Tobermory, the escarpment slips underwater and continues across the mouth of Georgian Bay as a submerged...
I'm just going to slide ahead a little bit here because I don't want to run over time and have people yelling at me, and we don't really care about harbors and stuff. What I wanted to show you was some of this underwater footage. So here they are diving on sweepstakes.
Aided by the knowledge of local fishermen and by the researches of marine historians such as Patrick Folks, they have managed to locate and dive upon a large number of the wrecked ships in this area. Realizing the historical importance of these finds, the Ontario government has been moved to declare the waters surrounding Tobermory as Canada's first underwater national park, to be called Fathom 5.
We'll also draw attention to the music. Bearing in mind they're on a dive that's about 18 feet deep. It sounds like something I think from, I don't know, The Exorcist or...
We are diving in Big Tub Harbor. Here we will find an almost perfectly intact survivor of the windship era, the three-masted schooner Sweepstakes. The Sweepstakes was built in Burlington, Ontario in 1867. She was a large ship with a length of 119 feet and a beam of 29 feet. The exact circumstances of her loss remain a mystery to this day, although it seems likely that she made for Tobermory in a damaged condition and was laid up and later abandoned.
I think that's probably what my wife's going to do to me at some point. Lay me up in a bed. I also would like to draw attention to this styling wetsuit and the triple tanks. Interestingly enough, there's a company in Australia starting to manufacture surfing suits that are very similar to this, and the belief is that they actually repel white sharks, which, as you know, is an issue in Georgian Bay. I think if I had seen and heard this film, I never would have taken up diving. This is the part where the crypt keeper surfaces from his dive. You'll also notice the rudder and the rudder post here, which is now lying in the goo off somewhere beside the boat. Shipwrecks are a bit like a metaphor for life, aren't they? The years go by, they sag a little more and parts start to drop off and generally rot and decay. So those of you that don't dive will know now the Sweepstakes has all been somewhat closed off, so you can't penetrate it any longer. Clearly it was far too scary and dangerous to do that, and but mostly the bubbles were causing it to erode and kind of fall apart. So I was part of the original volunteers that did the original rebuild on that back in 1981 or 2 or whatever it was. It was great fun. Raised the deck up and put some big rods through and bolted it all together, put the deck back in. So anyway, enough of that. I don't really want to terrify you any more than I probably have. So, oh look, there's fish.
Within a mast length of the Sweepstakes.
There we go. Interesting to see the water levels too. That they were just going to start talking about the city of Grand Rapids there, which of course is now a nice walk, and but nonetheless. So anyway, you noticed in the introduction that the name Patrick Folks, and Patrick is a guy that I have of course heard about forever. His book about the shipwrecks in Tobermory. It was absolutely required reading for anybody diving up here for the first time. I'd never met Patrick, still haven't. I hope he's not in the room because I'm about to say a bunch of stuff for him about him. I did have a nice chat with him, a couple of chats on the phone recently. But anyway, I guess through a kind of a series of coincidences and a little serendipity, and isn't that's Joe McGinnis's favorite word, I think, isn't it? Serendipity. And that somewhere early on, Patrick crossed paths with Stan and another fellow named Art Amos. And that little triumvirate of people sort of became the catalyst for much of the early identification and the early mapping and of the wrecks up here. I guess had always sort of guessed that all of these wrecks were sort of magically found until I actually started, people were out searching for them and hunting for them all over the place, and of course that wasn't the case at all. The local people, the fishermen, they knew where most of the wrecks were. I mean, hell, the Forest City was sticking out of the water on the side of Bear's Rump for quite a while, so everybody knew where that was. A lot of little bits and pieces were known, and fishermen would occasionally snag nets on things. And I guess my two favorite dives up here are the Arabia and the Forest City. And as I mentioned, the Forest City, everybody knew where it was, but it struck Bear's Rump back in the early 1900s, and then it was largely forgotten because there was no diving going on, so it was just another pile of stuff at the bottom of the lake. But Bob Peters, I mentioned earlier, lays claim to being one of the first divers on it. He took a boat out there many years ago, and his understanding is that the local folks back then, there was a fair bit of boat building going on in town, and lumber was never an issue, but nails were, and that they may have set fire to the top of the wreck as it was sticking out of the water to recover the nails. And so he was sort of swimming along the shore out there, found a bunch of nails on the bottom, so turned right and went down, and there was a great big shipwreck down there. And went down to about the boilers. It was his recollection. He was pretty much out of air. He came up and changed tanks and went back down again. And that was pretty much the first time that I believe that anyone had been actually diving on the Forest City. The Arabia, on the other hand, is out in the middle of nowhere. It sunk in 1884, so there wasn't a whole lot of people remembered exactly where it was, but they did know that they kept snagging nets out there. And the fish that they caught in that area were, if you saw them at the grocery store today, they would say corn fed, and because the fish they were catching often had corn in their bellies, and they knew that the Arabia was carrying corn as a cargo. So Patrick Folks is a historian, did a lot of work for the government, the military, and so on. And he had talked to Stan, and there was Steve Symes, who was one of the founders of GNS when he was, I think, about 18 years old, actually had issued a bounty on the Arabia that the first people to dive it would earn $200 for their dive club. And so Albert Smith, who is Holly's dad, who I knew many, many, many years ago, and a great guy. He was one of the early guys to capitalize on taking divers out. He had a pretty good idea of where this wreck was, and as I understand it, he had a group from Brantford. He went out, and they agreed they were going to look for this. They ran a big long line, about 300 feet long, with a shot line in the middle of it. The plan was for the divers to go down the shot line. Half were going to go this way, half were going to go that way. They were going to see if they could find the wreck. If they did, great. If they didn't, they'd move. Turns out the shot line was right smack in the middle of the boat. And so that was a little bit lucky, and I think, as others will talk later this weekend, finding a shipwreck is not always that simple. But anyway, they earned the $200, and away they went. But anyway, over time, I guess Patrick Folks and Stan McClellan and Art Amos, who of course owns Trails End Lodge out here, managed to map and explore a lot of the wrecks that are up here. A lot of the materials that they recovered are in the museum and are certainly worth looking. The final straw for identifying the Arabia, as I understand it, is they recovered the compass. And one of the things that Patrick had discovered in a pile of invoices somewhere was a bill for repairing the compass rose, which had been broken somewhere along the way. And when they pulled the compass apart to restore it, they noticed that it had in fact been repaired, and as was the custom of the time, the fellow who did the repair actually signed the back of the compass rose, and they now had that signature plus an invoice going back to the day, which was an absolute certainty that was the wreck. So that was something I didn't know, and you probably didn't either, and I thought that was pretty cool. Anyway, how are we doing for time? 28 minutes. How long have I got? Quite a while yet, eh? Are you bored yet? Need a break? Okay. I'm just kind of winging it. One of the things, when I started diving up here, my idea of exploring for shipwrecks is we had a couple of those Zodiacs, and Jeff had one, I had one, and our other friend Tom had one, and we had some rope and we had a piece of plywood, and that was what we called side scan. So we put one of the guys on the rope, and we'd drag each other around up and down all over the place until we bang into something. Never did really find anything. I remember we towed Tom into a fishing net one time. That was pretty cool. And the boat kind of went, and we waited. He says, oh, he's found something neat. And he didn't come up, and he didn't come up, and he didn't come up, and he didn't come up. And then I think I said, maybe we should go see what Tom found. And just then Tom surfaced with a bunch of monofilament hanging all over his head. And that was the first time we realized those little flags you see out there mark the ends of fish nets. Who knew? And So that was kind of fun. But one of the wrecks that we spent a lot of time looking for was called the Regina, which is out. Well, I don't know where it is because we never found it. But it's supposed to be out on the west coast of Cove Island. It's not a very big boat, but Patrick and I talked about that for 15 minutes on the phone the other day, and apparently it's been driving him nuts too. But we just between the two of us, we came to the conclusion that it got all beat up and it's all matchwood all scattered along the shore, and it's not out there because we've all looked for it for like 40, 50 years, and it's not there. So don't go out today looking for it because it's gone. So anyway, these guys have done a tremendous amount of work out here, and I say most of us that come to Tobermory, and certainly in current times, and we could just go, you take a charter boat out, and somebody's put a mooring on the wreck, and you swim down, you swim around, but it wasn't always that way, and it was interesting talking to these guys. So, but I think the other thing I think that is worth just touching on, again, if you're divers, you kind of understand the whole dive shop thing. The other thing I didn't know is, and again, Holly kind of confirmed this, that Albert Smith apparently had a bakery. Who knew? And he sold it to a guy named Lou Singer, who I did know. He and his wife, you would know, Lawrence. Lou and his wife Sally owned a big dive shop in Toronto called Supreme Divers, and that was the kind of place that you went into when you came out. You felt thoroughly, utterly violated, but you were the proud owner of a bunch of really bad dive gear and wetsuits that really didn't fit you, but you felt happy about it, and that was the main thing. But so anyway, they had what would become Divers Den. Steve had opened GNS. Big Tub didn't come for many years, and I think in my biography it says my first job out of school was running the dive shop over at Big Tub, which is, if there'd been any doubt that I loved Tobermory, it was certainly put to rest during that time when I lived up here. That was actually an interesting common theme talking to these old guys too. If I heard it once, I talked about 6 or 7 of these guys. If I heard it once, I heard it that many times. The first time I went to Tobermory, I just fell in love with the place, and everybody's going, and I knew. I mean, this is what they call preaching to the choir. Right, and it really is. It's an amazing place, and we all love it and know it, and I think that's about it. So, if you like, when I go diving, I haul a camera around with me, and I've been doing that for a really long time. And if there's any photographers in the crowd that dive and do underwater photography, you'll appreciate that zebra mussels, as much as we dislike them, have been the best single thing ever to happen to underwater photography in the Great Lakes. And back my first camera I bought in I got certified in 74, so I bought it in the summer of 75 with a fraudulently obtained bank loan. I asked my dad for some money. He wouldn't lend me the money, so I went to a bank and I said, I'd like to borrow some money to buy an underwater camera, and they said, no, you can't do that, that's stupid. So I went to a second bank, and they said the same thing. And then I was smart, and I went to the third bank, and I said, I need to borrow some money to buy textbooks to go to university in the fall. And they said, you're a good young man. So I bought a Nikonis 3 and a Sekonic light meter. I upgraded to the 28 millimeter lens, and away I went. And man, I wasted a lot of film. And I can't imagine trying to do a dive and take 24 pictures or 36 pictures or something like that. It's just things have changed so much. But so I think if you like, what I'll do, excuse me, just a little drink here. Did I mention we were at the Crow's Nest last night? So what this is just a little thing. So these are all, what you were looking at earlier were pictures from everywhere. These are pictures all from Tobermory. You'll see lots from the Forest Sea, you'll see lots from the Arabia, a few from the Wetmore, the Caroline Rose, the Tugs, some of the sort of non-wreck diving sites, the Grotto. If some of you dive the Dufferin Wall, you'll see pictures from the Dufferin Wall. You'll see pictures from Bad Neighbor Rock, where Shirky and I sneak out to once in a while, which if you like just falling down a really steep slope into nothingness, it's a really cool dive. And then I think this lasts for about, 10 minutes or so. So we're going to be almost right on time for some questions. So I'll stop talking, and with a little luck, this will work. Now again, is it possible to do anything with that big light? Does anyone know that?
Okay.
Thank you. I meant to mention before I started that those images that were shot under the ice were just taken last weekend. And if you know, you may know Zolt that owns the wow, that's really bright. Did I mention I was at the Crow's Nest last night? And I saw them. We're only Facebook friends. George and I don't actually know each other, but we're Facebook friends. And I saw those pictures. Said, dude, those are amazing. And so I asked him if I could borrow a few of them. But I said that I would make sure I gave credit because I just think they're amazing photographs. But so anyway, I think we got a couple of seconds for questions. If anybody has any, can't imagine you would.